Last week we had Doris Soto from Chile. I'm afraid she did get the time zones a little bit wrong and she was an hour late. So I'm really sorry if you tuned in just to find that you were completely alone and there was no one online. I'm really sorry. So but it is on the YouTube channel. For the people that watched it, like half of you guys emailed me to say how much you enjoyed the talk. So if you did miss it, go onto YouTube and watch Doris's talk because it was really, really good. Anyway, today we have Peter Dudley from NOAA, based in California by the sounds of it. I thought it was Washington State. But he's going to be talking about comprehensive climate change vulnerability assessments for fisheries, ecological systems. And this is based on a really beautiful, engaging paper in Frontiers in Marine Science. So maybe after this talk, if you're interested, I really do encourage just going to find that paper online. It's really, really, just really nicely laid out. So yeah, good morning, Peter. How are you feeling at 7 a.m.?
Excellent. Pretty good.
Great. And you know, we just had a blizzard here yesterday, but I'm guessing it's quite warm where you are, maybe.
Yeah, it was like 72 yesterday here. So
okay. All right. Nice. Well, we're pretty informal, so whenever you're ready, just give it a go.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me. So yeah, I'm talking about a more comprehensive climate vulnerability assessment for fisheries social-ecological systems. This work is based on a paper. Is my camera foggy for some reason?
It goes out of focus every now and then. So it is out of focus right now, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, so this work's based on a paper that I put in the chat, and I guess you can put it in the YouTube description if you'd like. So it's free paper, open access, and Frontiers. So this work is done with a group of collaborators, which is between UCSC, so University of California, Santa Cruz, and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, specifically NOAA Fisheries, the fisheries side of it. And those two organizations have a joint institute, which I'm part of, called the Fisheries Collaborative Program. So everyone in this list of co-authors is either a member of NOAA, UCSC, or the Fisheries Collaborative Program. Just a little bit about me before we get into this. I do not have a background in socio-ecological fishery systems. I'm actually a sort of conservation biologist for fish. I work on endangered anadromous fish, so green sturgeon, steelhead, and Chinook salmon in California. And so I came to that from conservation of sea turtles, and I actually took this seminar, which resulted in this paper, because if you are a fisheries biologist of any kind, when you talk to people about it in public, they'll basically ask you the questions of, you know, what fish should I eat? Is fishing good for the environment? Is fishing okay? And things like that. So I knew sort of the basic ecology about fisheries, but I wanted to learn more about the socio-ecological economic parts of fisheries. So I joined this group, and we did a seminar and worked on some papers and things like that for a couple of years. So that's all just to say my background is not strictly in this. It's mostly in conservation biology of specific fish, but yeah. So I'm going to do this talk in 4 parts. So the first part is going to be just some description of fisheries social-ecological systems, what they are, how they interact, and how perturbations can affect them. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what this group is doing at the time when we were thinking about these things and our motivation for ending up producing the tool that we did. And then I'm going to discuss the tool that we made, how it works, how you can apply it. And then I'll give you one example of the application of the tool. In the paper, there are 3. So you can go to the paper for the other 2 if you like. And then very briefly, just talk about a couple lessons that we learned from doing all this. So let's get into social ecological systems. So here's a cartoon drawing of a simplified social ecological system and some things that are in it that represent components of it. So first and foremost, in a fishery system, you have kind of the target fish. And we're going to break these things up into domains. And so first, we're going to talk about the actual fish species that you physically go out and target, or it could be multiple. Those are the fished species domain. And so this fished species interacts with the environment. So it might have things that it interacts with are sort of abiotic, maybe like some type of habitat feature, some type of geomorphic type thing. Then it also has lots of biotic things that it interacts with. So it might have a predator, for example. It might have certain types of prey that it goes after. And so that's another domain, just the biological components. We're going to call those the ecological community. So the other biological things it interacts with. Zooming out from that, we then have the fishery, and that fishery targets this fish species. And so we're just going to call that the fishery domain. Pretty simple. And then that fishery interacts with lots of different components of the human community. So there might be, for example, shoreside processors that the fishers sell their fish to. That shoreside processor then might sell it to a market or directly to a consumer. That consumer's desire for that fish has direct influence on the market for the fishery. There might be regulators that sort of place restrictions, time limits, gear types, things like that on the fishery. And then there's a whole other suite of community things around the fishery that are partially or wholly supported by it, things like stores, gas production, parts suppliers, things like that, that both support and benefit from this fishery. So that's a simplified diagram. So let's perturb it a little bit and see what might go on. Oh, sorry, and that's called the human community. So to recap here, we have the ecological community, the fish species, the fishery, and the human community. Those are our 4 domains. Then we're going to perturb this. And let's say we're going to perturb it in a certain way. So let's say we're going to have a gradual increase in temperature on this system. And so we're going to call that in our system, we're going to call it the trend or event going forward. And we call it trend or event because it could be a long-term trend, gradual increase in warming from climate change, the average temperature, or it could be an event like a marine heat wave type thing, or a hurricane, anything like that. And so let's say this event is gradual warming. So what might happen here? Well, the fish species, in gradual warming, people talk about things moving poleward in our northern hemisphere, moving north. So maybe the fish species moves north and it moves in this new environment, right? So it's still got habitat that's appropriate for it, but maybe represented by this breaking up. Maybe it's now patchier habitat as opposed to a large contiguous habitat. Maybe it's hanging out with another species that was around there that it never used to hang out with before. They might not directly interact, but they're now in the same area. Maybe, for example, half of its prey base goes with it. So one of the prey species moves up and the other prey species is kind of fine to hang out where it was. Maybe the predator is also fine to hang out where it was. And so then what's going to, of course, have to happen is the fishery is going to have to move north as well to target this species if it wants to keep targeting it. And so you can see that this fish species is now in a different sort of ecological framework than it was before, right? It's lost a predator, it's lost some prey base, it's in a broken up habitat. It's in the same zone as another species. And so maybe that changes the dynamics of the fishery. So maybe before the trend or event perturbed the system, maybe there was some fluctuations in the amount of catch they could get, but now there's more rapid or more severe fluctuations, right? It's sort of a boom or bust fishery now, maybe. And perhaps in the human community, things weren't set up like that. The economics of it was not set up to handle this sort of thing. So maybe fish processors weren't diversified. They were focused on using this sort of consistent fish resource they had. So they can't deal with this boom or bust system. So they might close, for example. There might then be other fisheries that can open in and supply consumers with a different type of fish that they then start to consume. Maybe in that area where they're interacting with this new species, there starts to be bycatch issues or other issues with the fishery, and regulators are not happy about this. So they place some other time, place, gear type restrictions on the fishery. And so that's an example of just a gradual trend. Of course, there can be lots of other ones. So for example, there might be increased stochasticity or fluctuations in the systems. There could be things like decreasing pH, ocean acidification. So there's lots of other trends or events that could happen. And so that's just a way of saying that this is a relatively simplified diagram, just has one fish, a few things, one type of boat, a few community things, and it's actually pretty complicated already. So these are pretty complicated, intricate systems to look at and analyze and understand fully. So that's what we're talking about. So what were we thinking about when we started going into this project? So like I mentioned, this is a collaboration between, this paper was a collaboration between UCSC and NOAA. California Department of Fish and Wildlife also participated somewhat throughout the process. So we were at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And we did all the work there for 2 reasons. Number one, when we started the work, the federal government was shut down, so we weren't allowed to go in the building. When we ended the work, the federal government was shut down for COVID. So we had two nice bookends to this project of not going in our federal government building. But we started off by looking at climate vulnerability assessments. And just to give you a little bit of background, I think most people in this group know the background of these, but climate vulnerability assessments are sort of a thing that came out of a thing that goes farther back called vulnerability assessments. So these are basically systematic ways of looking at threats or vulnerability from a situation. So they're frequently used in things like famine, droughts, issues like that. And so you basically set up a framework and you can look at, analyze a system to see how vulnerable it is to certain perturbations or events. These then naturally sort of, as climate change became an issue, people began to look at them as frameworks to look at climate change issues. And that's how you got climate vulnerability assessments. And they were sort of most codified in, I believe, the third IPCC report with this sort of framework right here. So the way the framework works is you have some system that you're looking at. It might be, a fishery or a biological organism or something. You check to see if it's exposed to the perturbation or change. So is it actually physically going to affect the area of the fish or the species or whatever it is in? You then check to see if it's sensitive. So this change is going to happen, but does it actually care about that change, or can it just weather it or deal with it? And those two things combine together to make what's called the impact. You then check, okay, so the species is exposed to it, it's sensitive, but maybe it has some adaptive capacity that even though it is exposed and sensitive, allows it to sort of at least mitigate or buffer against these changes. And out of those, you then get the final thing, which is the vulnerability. And so, we had vulnerability assessments led to climate vulnerability assessments, and then people began doing these about fisheries. So there's kind of three flavors of fisheries climate vulnerability assessments, seen here on the left. So there's ones that deal mostly with the ecological side. So they often will, acknowledge or have a fishery component of some type, but they really won't dissect it or break it down. They'll just look at the ecological side. There are those that look at the social-ecological side or social side, and they will often, acknowledge there's a fish base here we exploit or use, but they won't sort of break into the ecological parts of it. And then there's often obviously lots of interactions between these two things. So there's many that deal with both. So they try to encompass the whole ecological, social side of the system and analyze the full thing. So we started conducting this work in, I believe, 2019 or 2018. And so what were we doing? What were we thinking about then? Well, we got together and we began reading a bunch of papers and going through the literature and discussing climate vulnerability assessments on fisheries. And in the background of all this is something on the Pacific we were dealing with called the marine heat wave. So you might have heard of our friend the blob, and there was a big El Nino also during that time. So these things caused sort of a confluence of events that had anomalously warm temperatures from about 2014 through 16 off the Pacific coast. And they had an incredibly large effect on the system, but it was also incredibly complex, the way they actually ended up playing out. And so we did this in 2018, and at the time, lots of reports of like people looking back and being like, what happened with all this? We're coming out with all these, this happened, this led to this, and these complex feedbacks and interactions. So we were looking at these CVAs, we were looking at the complex interactions of the marine heat wave, and we thought, can these CVAs lay out these complex interactions we saw? And if not, can we make one that does? So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make some kind of tool that can help these systems prepare for climate change. One thing we saw a lot in the marine heat wave was unintended effects of trying to do things to deal with the marine heat wave. So we wanted to allow people to avoid unintended effects. And we thought a good way to do that might be give people an exercise to just map out possibilities of what might happen during these events. And so to map out sort of a relatively comprehensive suite of possibilities, you need to have a system that allows you to have feedbacks and complex interactions between the four domains that I laid out earlier, so the fishery, fish species, et cetera. And because lots of these systems are complex in different ways and interact in different ways, you'd want it to be flexible and modular. So we looked at the CVAs we had, and we didn't think any of them really fit this kind of category. So we wanted to sort of adapt the CVA framework a little bit to make sort of a new flexible and more modular one that we thought could lay out the possibilities of complex events like the marine heat wave happening. All right, so now let's get into the tool. All right, so here's the tool. It's outlined on the left. This is a big diagram from the book, not the book, the paper. And so you'll see here the domains are sort of color-coded. I'm going to jump over here for a second, just kind of lay out what the end product looks like before I describe it, because I think that might help you understand it better. What you're basically going to end up with is you're going to end up with a map of interactions and parts of the system, is what we're hoping that you'll have if you run this analysis in your system. And so just to lay out a couple things, the orange here, so we'll start with the purple, I guess. The purple here represents your ecological community. And so you might have various levels and components. There might be portions of the ecological community that interact with other portions that finally interact with your fish species. So this part can go back a couple layers. You might have different domains of your fishery. You might end up having different life stages of your fish species, different sectors of your fishery. Then you could then have different levels and components of your human community side. So you'll end up with a diagram that kind of looks like this. So just be thinking about this sort of end product as I describe the framework. So to begin with the framework, we decide to sort of graphically represent it outlined by this blue, which sort of represents the trend or event. And that sort of framing is just to give you a little mental thing that the trend or event encompasses all of this. So this framework is designed to look at things that are perturbed by the trend or event. So kind of focus on those as you do it. And so up here on the left, we just have some listed types of trends or events you might have: temperature, water quality, DO, etc. As we go through this, we're going to have things come out of each of these systems that are going to be called impacts. They're things that happen to a certain domain. And they're all going to be allowed to influence other domains. So we're going to put them in this sort of bank up here called outcomes. So anything that happens from the system can go into an outcome, and that can then feed back into the system. So first of all, in that outcomes bank, we're going to put our trend or event in there. So that's something that might influence the rest of the system. So let's look down at the ecological community first. So the first thing you do with the ecological community is you separate it into component species. And so these component species will relate to some other portion of your system in some way. So for example, they could be predators, pathogens, prey, competitors, habitat forming species. They could just be ones that are share the same range or things like that. So lots of different possibilities. So what you're going to do is you're going to go through something that looks very similar to the framework I outlined before. You're going to then look at the exposures. And so what changes will be experienced? In these exposures, the ultimate exposure needs to always come from the trend or event. But as those trends or events cascade through the system, other things could come back and affect the ecological community. So for example, other members of the ecological community could be affected. Some change to the fish species might cause some exposure to the ecological community, the fishery, the human community, etc. So once you've highlighted an exposure, you then have to check if it's sensitive. And we're going to check what variable is sensitive to it. So you're going to specifically find a variable that might be sensitive to, say, for example, increase in temperature. So these are some variables that might be sensitive for a species. So for example, abundance, spatial distribution, temporal distribution, condition, lots of things like that. So once you find your exposure and your sensitivity, you're going to want to check if those things have any adaptive capacity. So we've sort of broken these up into sort of 4 categories here. So just diversity aspects of adaptive capacity, so things like genetic or phenotypic, life history, plasticity, so things like behavior or physiological or phenotypic plasticity. Also just your life history might give you some adaptive capacity to certain things. Population structure might. And once you've run those 3 things, you'll end up with an impact. So these are changes that are not mitigated or prevented by the adaptive capacity that the exposure caused on the sensitive variable. That impact then goes into your bank of outcomes to maybe influence something else down the line. We then jump to our fish species. So this is very similar categories to the one above. We have the same categories in the trend, in the exposure. The same categories in sensitive variables, with one addition. We have quality down there. So the quality is something that represents something that the fishery might care about, but maybe doesn't affect the actual fish species or other aspects. So things like, quality of the meat, or maybe there's some contaminant that doesn't affect the species, but maybe is not safe for human consumption. Adaptive capacity are all the same thing for impacts. Those feed back into the outcomes. Moving on to the human side of stuff, fishery. So now we see the same exposures on each side. The variables are now different. So these are things that are variables that might be affected by or affected in the fishery community. So opportunity, timing, location, effort, things like that, safety, satisfaction. Adaptive capacity is divided up into two categories. So resources, so things they have access to that can help buffer them against these changes, and then flexibility, so options they have to pursue. Do they have other, fish species they can target, other gear methods they can use? Can they move to different locations? Things like that. Those impacts go back in outcomes. And the final one, the human community, same exposures, the same four categories. Different set of sensitive variables, things that you could think about that are related to a fishery sort of production as relates to human community. So things like governance, nutrition, health, etc. Again, resources and community flexibility. Then also separate out here a little bit of governance, so governance options and governance flexibility as relates to the fishery. And then changes not prevented go back in the outcomes. And so you keep on working through the system to map out the events or the things you think might happen given a certain perturbation or event. And so hopefully this might be a little bit clearer now. But so for example, you might have some fish species that is affected by a predator, and that predator initially, had its habitat forming species increase. So kelp beds increased and there was more sea stars or whatever, and therefore they reduced something like that. So it can go back a couple levels. And there's different life stages. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. So the fish species is broken out into different life stages. Fisheries broken out into different sectors, and then just kind of like the ecological community, the human community is broken out into different levels where they're sort of separated. So this would be a shoreside processor. This would be, a household consumer, maybe bought from the processor or a grocery store or whatever. So you want to make a little chart like that that shows you the possibilities of these outcomes. So the application of it, what are some suggestions we have? So I'll just go through these suggestions now. First of all, get a diverse team. So we call it transdisciplinary. So people from lots of different disciplines, not just a bunch of economists or a bunch of ecologists or things like that. Try and get a team and try and pull in people who are, managers, scientists, managers looking at it from the economics framework, or scientists looking at it from the ecological framework. Try and pull in members who just practice this community if they're willing to give you the time. So actual fishermen, fishers, shoreside processors, things like that. Choose one trend or event. So just pick one. Don't pick multiples. And even if there's, don't pick climate change. Pick temperature increase from climate change. I would advise, because as you're going to see going through here, or as you probably just noticed, this is a very complicated system. So you do want to try and constrain it as much as possible. And of course, you have to balance that out with always the desire to have, consider all variables and make sure everything's included. So you want to kind of narrow it on one trend or event. You want to pick either a starting point of a fishery or a fish species is our recommendation. So don't sort of pick ecological community or a human community. That would probably make the system balloon up and get too complicated. So start with a fishery or a fish species. And you could even zoom in finer than that. You could pick a certain life stage of a fish species or a certain gear type of a fishery if you really wanted to sort of start basic and work your way out. So then data, you need lots of data. So of course, you can always go to literature to get data about this system, what the system has seen in the past, what perturbs it. Talk to people who are working in the system. So, it's hard to get people who have day jobs that aren't scientists to agree to engage in these groups full hands. So if you can get their input through interviews or things like that, those are very important. We did a lot of phone calls and interviews with shoreside processors, fisheries people, things like that, to get their views of the system, because a lot of what they're experienced, never gets written up in reports, or it's written up in sort of hard to find news articles and things like that. And talk to members who are practitioners in other parts of the community, who might see the influences or ripple effects of these changes. So as you do this, try and go into the past in your system. So obviously look to the historical record, things that happened before, were there sudden increases in temperature, sudden events that might mimic the ones you're considering, or things like that. And also try and find analogous systems that are similar to yours. Maybe look somewhere up or down the coast, or some other coast around the world where some other fish species experience something. See if there's some analogy there you might want to consider or look into. Constrain your system in as many ways possible. As I mentioned, it's a complicated system, so try and find ways that you can constrain your system without, ignoring very important effects, obviously. But try and think of, I'm only going to go back so many levels, or I only care about going back to this level in the ecological community, or I just want to care about the shoreside processors. When I do this analysis, I'm not going to go into the consumer level or things like that. Then run it through the system. So use your group, use your knowledge, all the literature you developed, all the interviews you did to try and analyze and build up the system. We did this over many semesters. You could conceivably do it in an intensive workshop if you had enough experts and expertise in there to try and map this out. All right, so that's the tool. So we're going to show you in our paper, we did 2 retrospective and 1 prospective analysis of it. So the 2 ones we did were about the marine heat wave, and then we did another one about albacore tuna and just climate change in general, or not climate change, gradual warming in general. So these diagrams done by Tanya Rogers. She has a website called Outside the Quadrat, Beyond the Quadrat. I'll find it in a second. Where she does lots and lots of graphics design stuff. So she's a scientist. She's a stock assessor and a great scientist and all that. But she also does graphics art. She made the logo for our lab, which is very cool. So all the cool diagrams in the paper are hers. So this is a diagram of the Dungeness crab fishery and what happened with the marine heat wave. So it's divided up into 4 sections. So we have before the marine heat wave on the top, and then we have the winter and the spring season in the columns, and then during the marine heat wave on the bottom. Things are color-coded as they were before. So the blue is the trend or event, the purple is the ecological community, orange is the fish species, gray is the fishery, and green is the human community. So let's look at this under normal times. So winter season before the marine heat wave. So that's the prime season for the crab fishery. You have the Dungeness crab fishery. They target Dungeness crabs. Dungeness crabs prey on bivalves. There's state regulators that oversee this. There's a live crab market and market that goes to consumers. And then there's a seafood supply chain that they sell their stuff to. So this process chugs along. It's a big California industry during normal times. Then in the spring, Dungeness crab fishing still goes on at a much reduced level, but it still happens. So they're out there somewhat fishing. And in the spring, there's a large whale migration off California. So there's frequently whales off the coast of California, but there's a particularly large migration at this time. So they come through, they forage, and their preferred prey base is krill, which are sort of frequently slightly offshore, away from where the crab fisheries often go. And there's also this alternate prey base, the northern anchovy, which the whales will also feed on. So that's the system before the marine heat wave. So after the marine, or during the marine heat wave, so there's a warm water pool that forms. So the warm water pool, that's the trend or event. So that then leads to a harmful algae bloom. So that's the first species in our ecological community. The harmful algae bloom causes bivalves to have an increased level or start to contain domoic acid. So this is the second level of our ecological community. And those bivalves are the prey of Dungeness crabs. So the Dungeness crabs then begin to contain domoic acid. And that's what I mentioned before, which is this is their quality, right? So as far as we know, as of right now, the domoic acid concentration in the crabs didn't really affect them. So they seem to be otherwise unaffected. But state regulators then saw this. So we have the fisheries industry directly interacting with the human community through governance. They see this and they regulate and say, okay, we can't open the fishery yet to protect human health. So then the regulatory changes cause an impact on the fishery itself. which is the fishery delay. The fishery opening is delayed. That then has a feedback into the fishery itself, which is reduced effort, reduced catch, and reduced revenue. And then those fishery opening delays cause impacts back into the human community, which is a disruption in the food supply chain and cultural traditions. Around the holidays, so Thanksgiving through like New Year's, I guess, is a big Dungeness crab time in California. So people enjoy to get together and eat them. So no crab during peak holiday demands. And there's also lingering concerns about seafood, because once you have sort of a health scare in something, even if that health scare clears up, consumers tend to have a long tail on getting back to it. So that's what happened. The fishery was delayed. So that seems pretty straightforward so far. There's some feedbacks there, but not too bad. But then what happened next gets more complicated in that, okay, so the warm water pool is still there, and then the thermal habitat compression happens. So krill are low in the offshore community, and young of the year anchovies are abundant inshore in the community. So you have this habitat of forage base for the whales get compressed. So we have the trend or event influences a member of the ecological community, and then influences another member of the ecological community, which is not directly related to the crabs, but is related to the fishery itself. So the whales and the crabs don't interact, but they both interact with the fishery. So the whales migrate inshore, which is where the crab pots are, and we see an increased amount of whale entanglement in the crab gear. And this wouldn't have been maybe a huge issue because they were coming through in the spring, but because the fishery was delayed in the opening, there was a huge, intense fishing pressure now inshore where the whales happen to be migrating at this time. And so we have the whales move in here, the fishery be delayed, so there's a temporal spatial sort of interaction. Huge whale entanglement problem, and regulators had to step in to protect the whales and put more restrictions on the fishery. So that is a complicated mapping out of how the system works. And so you can see how, in this lovely diagram, you build this up this way. You can also build this up in sort of a framework diagram. So that's one example. There's two other in the paper. I encourage you to go look at them. Some lessons learned, just a couple takeaway lessons. So there's lots of things, but a few things we noticed that there's in these systems, we analyze them. Even if you analyze, say it's not the green heat wave, there are almost always complex feedbacks interactions, especially when dealing with the social side of stuff. Often spatial changes are sometimes more important than actual changes in abundance and things like that. So changes in timing and space can interact in complex ways that often affect these systems, are often the driver of effects in these systems. The effects are complex, and you should consider things often beyond abundance, so these complex interactions we just looked at. And so that's our CVA tool for assessing complex climate change vulnerability stuff. The paper is in Frontiers. I put in the chat. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Peter. Really refreshing to see all these beautiful diagrams. I first saw your paper before we were doing a vulnerability assessment. So a year ago, it really helped me understand kind of all the different levels of detail and intricacies